Hi, I'm H. Peter Steeves, and I'm Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Humanities Center at DePaul University. Animal rights is a term that we use in philosophy to talk about the ethical status of non-human animals, and in law to talk about the legal status of non-human animals. In both instances, it's just one way to talk about whether or not animals, and I'm going to go ahead and use the term animal here to mean non-human animal the rest of the time. It's one way to talk about whether or not animals count, if they matter, if they have some sort of normative standing in your community such that you have to take them seriously as subjects. That being said, the term rights is itself complicated. It's not even clear when it became the way to talk about how we treat subjects. It's pretty obvious that it's related to liberalism and modernity and the Enlightenment, though it was in use sometime before, and it's become the only way, basically, to talk about such things today. The majority of political philosophy that's being done these days has something to do with rights. And if you ask people outside of academia about someone's moral standing or legal standing, they'll usually talk about rights as well. Some consider rights, whether for humans or non-human animals, to be natural, and some consider them to be artificial or social and cultural. Natural rights are the sorts of rights you would have that are based on your inherent nature, perhaps due to your species classification or some sort of ability or quality that you have naturally, such as consciousness or the ability to use language or tools. Divine rights would count as a kind of natural right, a right given to you by God. These are opposed to civil, cultural, social rights, artificial rights that have been given to you by some sort of authority figure, usually some political organization like a government or perhaps even a document like a constitution. In the Enlightenment tradition, it was usually a social contract that would give subjects their rights. The subjects would get together and out of mutual shared self-interest, they would decide that they're going to use rights now to solve all future adjudications when it comes to clashing interests. Some look at the history of the West and they see that the way that rights have unfolded is as a kind of expanding circle of who gets to count. It begins with white men who owned property. It starts including and expanding out to include other sorts of men, eventually white women, then men and women of color, and now we're to the point where we're talking about animal rights, having included them. Even if this story is true, after deciding who has rights and what sorts of rights they are, that's not the end of the story, because it's typically the case that we then have to compare the rights of all parties when there are clashing interests and see whose rights prevail. In other words, some rights can be revoked, some can be denied, some can come into battle with other subjects' rights and lose. In fact, rights are sort of like weapons or shields that one can bring into battle. When it comes to animals, even if animals have rights, sometimes human rights might trump animal rights, so it's a complicated situation. Generally speaking, however, animal rights is a phrase or a field of inquiry that usually means that animals are considered to be the subject of a life and they deserve to be treated as such. In fact, animal rights is sometimes put in contradiction to animal ethics that take up a utilitarian approach. So animal rights would be more associated with deontology, or the field of philosophy that Immanuel Kant more or less founded. And that's different than John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism. So for instance, someone who works on animal morality as a utilitarian cares very much about animal welfare in terms of happiness, suffering, pain, and they let that count in the general world calculus of such. But if you are an animal rights person, you can still care about animal suffering and pain, but not really per se. You would only care because they have a right not to suffer and be in pain. So in my own work, I have tended to argue against using rights-based language to talk about animals or even non-human animals, simply because as an anarchic communitarian, I don't really buy into the foundations of the Enlightenment and modernity and liberalism that gave rise to social contract theory that found so much of the talk about rights these days. Rights are just one way of cashing out our intricate ways of being morally enmeshed with each other in the living world, I think, and in fact, they're a limiting way, and a way that stacks the deck against some subjects. That being said, when someone outside of academia asks me about my work with animals, I very often say, oh, I work in animal rights, because it's just a shorthand way of saying I care about animals and I take them seriously morally. So as you can see, animal rights has a lot of different meanings and a lot of different registers, and it's a very complicated issue. I hope that we've elucidated some of them in this brief talk. Thanks for watching.